Welcome to today's webinar, Basic Income, the International Response to COVID-19. My name is Natasha Pei. I'm a manager for Cities Reducing Poverty, and I'm here to introduce our moderator and co-host for today's call, Tom Cooper. So for those who don't know him yet, for the past 9 years, Tom has served as the director of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, a collaborative organization formed to tackle the city's unacceptable levels of poverty. Through the Roundtable's work, Tom has engaged governments at all levels to invest in poverty reduction initiatives and work to give people experiencing poverty a voice in decisions that affect their lives. He's advocated for social assistance rates that reflect the real cost of living, fought to end predatory lending in Ontario, and helped to co-found the Ontario Living Wage Network, an initiative of 30 Ontario communities endeavoring to address working poverty. Tom was involved in helping to establish Ontario's first basic income pilot, a critical research project testing whether providing a basic income would stabilize housing, improve health, and enhance social inclusion opportunities for low-income residents. He has helped us put together this e-learning series on basic income. So thanks for joining us, Tom, and helping to bring this fantastic panel together. I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce today's guest.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the international response to COVID-19 from a basic income lens. Before we get started, though, and I introduce our guest panelists, I'd like to bring on Deirdre Pike to do a land recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. It is important, before we begin this essential conversation, to ground it in the acknowledgement that from wherever we are joining this meeting today, for those of us who are non-Indigenous, we are settlers and we are guests on this land. The city in which I stand today is situated upon the ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land, as determined by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It is also an area with long-standing relationships to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Six Nations of the Grand River. I know there are participants on this call from parts throughout the world, but the majority of us are somewhere on Turtle Island today. No matter where you are, if you know the traditional name of the territory in which you are seated right now, please say it. We're all on mute. You can say it aloud or in the silence of your heart. We are grateful to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. We hold our hands up to their amazing resistance, resilience, and strength in the face of ongoing dispossession and colonial violence. To acknowledge these lands is to take one step in demonstrating our commitment to the process of dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. May we bring that same commitment and spirit of truth-seeking and reconciliation to this conversation today. And so be it.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Very much appreciate that. And we're looking forward to this discussion. We have a great group of panelists, so I'd like to introduce them now, and then we'll get into a few early questions, but I'd like to leave most of the time to you. We've already have a few questions coming in, but as you're hearing the initial discussion, maybe think up any burning questions you may have, and feel free to put them in the Q&A panel, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So first, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Kim Pate. Kim Pate was appointed to the Senate of Canada on November 10th, 2016. First and foremost, she's the mother of Michael and Madison. She's also nationally renowned as an advocate who has spent the last 40 years working in and around the legal and penal systems of Canada with and on behalf of some of the most marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized, particularly imprisoned youth, men and women. And she has absolutely been an astounding voice for those groups over the last 2 months, as that group, many of whom have been left in incarceration, needed a voice to speak on their behalf. I'd also like to introduce Scott Santens. Many of us know Scott quite well. He was acknowledged by Andrew Yang in his book, The War on Normal People, as one of those who helped shape his thinking. And he's described by historian Rutger Bregman as by far the most effective basic income activist out there. Scott Santens has lived with the crowd-funded basic income since 2016 and has been researching and advocating for the idea around the world since 2013. He, of course, is a good friend to us in Canada, and particularly to the participants in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, who he spoke on behalf of so steadfastly. He is currently serving on the board of directors of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity and is editor of Basic Income Today, a daily UBI news hub. And as of February 2020, he is serving as senior policy advisor to Mike Brokier in his campaign for the US Senate against Mitch McConnell, a name many of us will recognize. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce my friend Jamie Cook from RSA Scotland. Jamie leads the development of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce activity in Scotland through innovative partnerships, programs of activity. He works with fellows to strengthen RCA Scotland's impact and to open new ways to develop opportunities in Scotland which contribute to the RCA strategic objectives. Particular areas of interest for Jamie include basic income, inclusive growth, the role of cities in Scotland and Scotland's relationship with the rest of the world. RSA recently released a report on proposing basic income pilots in Scotland. So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that. First of all, I should say I hope everybody is doing well during this tremendously stressful time. I know our health concerns are of primary concern right now, but also the economic consequences of the global pandemic. So I'm going to start the first question for you, Scott. The United States has lost 20 million jobs just in April. We've seen images of cars lined up visiting food banks, and of course there's growing tensions that we've all seen on the news and on social media with many people wanting to restart the economy. The initial response of the US government was to provide a check, stimulus check of $1,200 to every American. But you've argued, Scott, that it didn't go deep enough and it isn't far enough. Can you talk to us a little bit about why this financial crisis is different from anything we've seen in the past?
Yeah, so first of all, the stimulus check that we sent out, one of the problems with it is that it did not go to everyone. We actually means tested it so that those earning under $75,000 got the full $1,200, and then those earning over $75,000 to $98,000, because it was a 5% clawback rate, got a reduced amount, and then anyone earning over $98,000 as a single adult got nothing. And then, of course, you can double those for the couples. And yeah, that's a problem. And then, of course, when we went on a little bit more, we discovered there were some more details involved, as in if you were a dependent, as in dependent age between like 18 and 22 as a college student. So basically all these college students didn't get the amount because they were claimed by their parents, and their parents didn't get, $500 because they were, $500 was per kid instead of per dependent. And so a lot of people didn't get this income. And then, of course, too, there's the time. And so, this was something that was passed back in March. And I actually just got my stimulus payment, I think it was last week. And many, many people still have not received theirs. In fact, they just stopped the ability to put in your direct deposit information. And now everyone is just about to be mailed the checks. And, so then how long is that going to take for people to get? So here we are in May and still people haven't gotten this. So that really points to an issue with both means testing and the reality of like the bureaucracy involved, and the reality of of how long these things actually take and who they actually reach. One of the things that that makes this so different, it really is, it feels like what many of us have been talking about as far as the effects of automation goes, as far as how many jobs it would eliminate. And instead of the elimination of these jobs happening over the course of the next couple decades, it happened all at once. And so here we are, just immediately, all these people that are unemployed. And in fact, the newest numbers that just came out today here in the US is that now an additional 3 million people successfully filed for unemployment. And that brings it up to 37 million that have filed for unemployment since this started. And that's also, I say, successfully filed for unemployment, because actually half of the people haven't even filed for unemployment who have become unemployed, which means that we could be looking at around 74 million people in the US unemployed. And if we're right before this all happened, we were at 158 million. So effectively, we're at a 50% unemployment rate here in the US as far as the actual number of people who are without jobs. All these people are being forced into these, the safety net that we have, that being the unemployment insurance system. And a lot of that doesn't reach people. And of course, as you mentioned, the food banks, and just thousands of people lined up for that. And here we are, we have people plowing under their crops, the farmers who aren't able to sell to restaurants anymore, and plenty of food in stores for the most part, with some supply chain issues here and there. But the problem is people don't have money. So I wish that we more quickly realized that what was going to happen required people needing money as soon as possible, and with as few conditions as possible. And of course, in the US, we didn't do that. As we like to do, we always like to do everything else before the right thing first.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. And very sobering analysis of the current situation. Jamie, I'll go to you next. And the UK has also been hit very hard by the COVID-19 outbreak. Both the US and the UK actually have the highest number of cases currently. And there has been some pushback, I think, from observers in the United Kingdom that the Boris Johnson government maybe didn't respond as quickly as they could have to the health crisis. But they did put in some measures to deal with the economic crisis that people were dealing with. And it wasn't a basic income. What they did do was agree to pay 80% of the wages for furloughed workers, up to £2,500 per month. So my question to you, Jamie, is that furloughed worker scheme working? And if not, is basic income a better approach to the current crisis and moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And sadly, yes, the UK seems to be doing its best to give the US a run for its money to see who can handle things worse just now. I think there will be a lot of fallout about this in the future. And I think whilst it's been a very difficult and changeable situation throughout, and every government is dealing with things that they're not sure about, I think some of the kind of slowness of handling and some of the way things have been put across will definitely be investigated in due course. I think as well, one of the other things that's really shown up as someone living in Scotland is the difference and the kind of strain that's there on the very concept of the United Kingdom. So there was an article today pointing out that one of the issues of COVID has been that it's shown underlying health issues that people have, but actually it's showing underlying health issues that nations have. And I think we can see that with the US. These issues are already there. This is highlighting them, and I think it's the same in the UK. So we're now in a position where obviously you may have seen England is now going in a very different path in terms of response to the virus than the rest of the UK is, so Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And I think that's going to be an interesting situation to watch over the coming weeks. In terms of the economic and the support for workers, so the scheme you mentioned, the furlough scheme, was introduced and covers, as you say, 80% of earnings. And this was intended to try and encourage employers to not lay people off, to at least keep them working. And in one sense, I think it is quite a welcome approach, but with very serious shortcomings. So, and unsurprising to anyone who knows me, yes, I think a basic income would have been a significantly better policy. And crucially, we needed it in place before we hit this crisis, and we would have been in a very different position overall. The thing with the furlough scheme, so a few issues. One is, and this may sound cynical, but I think it's a fair reflection. I think the intention has been to try and push things down the line as far as possible, in the hope that actually the crisis will have started to pass and the government will have told people we're going to give you money, but then won't actually have to give it out. So much as Scott mentioned, some of these policies, although announced several weeks ago, people are only starting to receive some of the money, particularly for self-employed people. And they were a major missing part of the support. Now, of course, within a basic income, they would have been supported. The furlough scheme was only for people who were employed. So you had this entire raft of people, not only, I suppose, the traditionally self-employed, but also those we can see in the gig economy, the ones working for delivery companies who are forced to be identified as self-employed, who had no choice but to continue working because there was no finances in place. It was eventually announced that they would get some support, but as I say, that's only starting to kick in now. And is also requiring people to go through the universal credit system, which is the benefits, the social security system for the UK, which we all knew was an absolute disaster. If you look at the work of Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur, it's an abysmal system that's falling apart anyway. Suddenly forcing, much as Scott said, with a number of people forced into kind of support in the US, it's showing people the challenges. And I think what's interesting about that is that it may actually start, and is starting to change, the public opinion, because the kind of media and political message we've had that, you know, social security was for scroungers and was an overly generous system has been shown up to an awful lot of people now that it's a really horrible, difficult, bureaucratic and failing process. I think what we've seen most recently are two very telling issues. So one is that the Chancellor of the UK had talked about stopping the furlough scheme. And it's only through pressure, particularly from the unions, that it's been agreed to extend it. Now, given that we see no immediate end to this crisis, the idea of cutting it at this point is ludicrous. It has been extended temporarily just now. I think the other thing is that there was a report in the media the other day that the description from the government was that the people of the United Kingdom needed to be weaned off their addiction to the furlough scheme. So instead of this being seen as a necessary and positive support, being seen as an expensive addiction. When you put it in context, even if we run this throughout the crisis, we will have spent a tiny fraction of what we spent on, for example, bailing out the banks previously. And yet, to build this as an addiction, I think is very telling of the political scene. So there are some positives. I don't want to completely take away from at least some of the things being put in, but I think far too little, far too late, and far too inconsistently, from my opinion.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Jamie. And I do want to touch on the public response to the idea of basic income in our next question, but I'm going to turn to Senator Pate. Kim, the Canadian government has instituted, in a sense, a hybrid of the two schemes. So we have the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, which is providing $2,000 a month to workers who have lost income as a result of the quarantine and the lockdown. And we also have additional supports to help employers keep their workers on in that employment. And I would probably suggest that the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit is the most wide-ranging and significant income support program this country has seen, certainly in this generation, maybe in its history. But you've argued, and I've heard you say that others are being left behind, and it's not meeting the needs of all Canadians. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit and talk to us a little bit about why you think a minimum income may be a better approach?
Great. Thank you very much for this. And thank you for organizing this, to all of you, and for the other presenters. And I also want to thank Deirdre for the opening and acknowledgement of country and territory. I come to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, otherwise known to many as Ottawa, and the capital of Canada. And I mean, the whole reason I actually agreed when I was asked to consider a nomination to the Senate Canada was an interest, a long-standing interest in the need for more substantive equality in our country. The area that I work that you talked about, you know, who's in jails, who's on the street, who's going missing, being murdered, found homeless. It tends to be those who are most marginalized. And so, in fact, one of the main objectives of being part of the Senate was, I was appointed on my 57th birthday, and if I don't cark it before, I've got till I'm 75. And one of the main objectives was to look at an array of initiatives that would increase substantive equality in Canada, including a guaranteed livable income, including better wage protections, benefit programs, including pharmacare, dental care, full health care, not just minimal health care, and free post-secondary education. So those are some of the things that we know are fundamental to creating greater opportunities for everybody and creating a greater likelihood that people can reach their basic potential. It's probably not a surprise to anyone. I came from a working class background and was one of the first in my family to get a university education. And that's not accidental. I mean, the opportunities that so many people don't have if they, and my mom was born in Doncaster in Yorkshire, and my dad was born in Boston. So, you know, I feel a kind of affinity to some of, to both Scott and Jamie. But and so, you know, we see the need to ensure that we deal with the substantive inequality. And who's left behind now? Well, Canada has, we're sitting again tomorrow because we've got another patch being attached. And so what we're seeing, and you're doing an excellent job, Tom, and thank you for that, of documenting who's missing. I put out a message on Facebook just yesterday saying, is there anybody else across the country? And we've had a flood of messages. So there are many people still falling through the cracks, even of a model that internationally many are saying is, is a good model, but many people are still falling through the cracks, and I'm hearing from many of them. And so whether it's, as you've already mentioned, people are unemployed, people who are living, you know, I heard from someone, a hairdresser who rents a chair, but, you know, and hasn't really was on the street as a kid, never really registered, doesn't even know what their social insurance number is. And so, you know, you're everything from that to the person who's decided to go back to school and now doesn't know whether they actually fit as a new student, to the person who just got out of prison and is trying to figure out how to support themselves, and without money can't find a place to live, on and on. And so I don't need to tell any of you because you know all these stories as well. And so from my perspective, we need to look at an income tested model. We need to look at a basic payment that would go out to anybody who's in need. And for those who aren't already on, whether in our country it's the tax rolls or, you know, it's people in First Nations who, for all kinds of reasons, haven't access, or people on the street, we need to figure out ways to actually bring them in so that the resources can go out to them quickly. And anybody can have it when they're in need. And what this pandemic has shown is, yes, we weren't ready. We have eviscerated our social, economic, and health safety nets in ways that leave us, all of us, incredibly vulnerable. But it's not the great equalizer that people are talking about. It's actually revealed the massive inequality that exists amongst, whether it's by class, race, gender, and on and on. And so, so I think there's lots of room for movement. I think I'm really heartened by the push that's coming internationally to do things differently. And I think we could see the sea change that I had hoped to see, you know, before I retired. And, you know, maybe I should get kicked out of the Senate and, you know, someone else could come in then if we actually achieve it.
Thank you, Kim. Appreciate that. So let's move to that idea around the growing political demand for basic income. And Scott, I'll go back to you. You, of course, have been one of the US's foremost advocates for basic income. And you're very close with Andrew Yang, who, by the way, for those of us who listen to CBC Radio, Andrew Yang was on The Current earlier today with Matt Galloway. But we've seen the idea of basic income move beyond really something that was championed by yourself and Andrew, to really a much louder call from right across the political spectrum now, given our current financial and health crisis. So we've seen Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others calling for a basic income to respond to really our unprecedented challenges right now. Even Republicans like Mitt Romney are doing it. So Scott, my question to you is, what does that political focus look like? And you guys are heading into a presidential election this fall. You're deeply involved in a Senate campaign. Do you think basic income will be one of the key issues in November?
You know, I would like to think so, and at the same time, it's unfortunate too how, let's say, by November, so many more people are going to be in dire straits that maybe they'll be shaken up a bit to the point where it is a big issue. So on the one hand, you know, I'm happy for it to be a big issue, but on the other hand, I hate that it's requiring just so much human suffering in order for this to happen. There's a few different bills right now in the U.S. Rashida Tlaib and Pramila Jayapal have what's closest to a universal basic income, in how it's $2,000 per month per person, fully universally. This means not only just citizens and legal residents, but undocumented immigrants. Like they're trying to reach everybody possible. And it's the same amount per kid as it is adult. So it's just like fully universal. And it would be $2,000 per month while this crisis is continuing. And then for $1,000 a month for a year afterward. And so that is like full on UBI. And that has almost 20 co-sponsors right now. It's overshadowed by a bill called the Emergency Money for People Act, which was introduced by Tim Ryan and Ro Khanna. That bill has around 40 co-sponsors now. That is a means-tested version. It's kind of an improved version of the stimulus bill. And so this would be up to $130,000. That's the line. And it goes to, tries to get the dependents, and, it's per kid, $500 per kid for up to 3 kids. And then the most recent version is Senator Sanders, as you said, Kamala Harris, and Ed Markey's version. That actually hasn't been put on the floor yet. They just released it as far as the press release goes. I'm really wondering why it's taking so long to actually announce on the floor. But that too, so that's $2,000 per month, and that claws back at a 10% rate instead of a 5% rate, starting at $100,000. And that would actually give the full amount to kids as well, up to actually dependents and kids as well, up to 3. So again, it's like, they're trying to fill some of the holes that they saw that were created by the stimulus bill, but it's not fully universal. And also both of those two were recurring. So those are our emergency basic income kind of approaches, with Pramila's being the main one. And as far as support goes too, it's growing. I've seen multiple polls, and each one say they support for Americans, among Americans, for a recurring emergency $2,000 per month payment is in the 60%. 66% I've seen, 60% I've seen, and that's even 52% among Republicans. So at least there's support there. What's unfortunate is we're just not seeing a lot of legislators in Congress who are conservatives pushing for this. Like Justin Amash was a Republican. He left the party and became an independent, and now actually he's running for the president as a libertarian. He is for this. So that's a conservative for this. And as you mentioned, Mitt Romney was for the stimulus payment of $1,000 per month. Although what's interesting too right now is Mitt Romney is for what he calls Patriot Pay. And so Patriot Pay would provide a income boost to everyone who is employed. And part of that is seen as unfair that we gave a $600 per week boost as part of our unemployment boost approach to this. And that seemed unfair because you actually made the conditions where someone could actually earn more money unemployed as a non-essential worker compared to someone who's considered essential, and they're earning less than the unemployed person because of that boost. So now they're thinking, okay, well, let's boost this. And as we all know, as far as basic income goes, basic income accomplishes both. It actually helps the unemployed and the employed. Yep. And so it's weird that we're kind of going about this in like a partial, thing at a time setup that doesn't have all the benefits that we actually want that come from a full security of unconditionality. So yeah, I hope that there's some support building, and it just things are happening so quickly. And I hope that some conservatives come out soon for this and start pushing for it instead of what seems to be happening as far as really pushing against it, and instead just going full on, let's reopen the economy no matter what.
I hear you. Thank you, Scott. Jamie, I'm going to turn to you. You have a bit of a different situation in the UK, of course. Scotland as a country has come out in favor, at least the First Minister has, Nicola Sturgeon, in favor of the idea of basic income. But the way the division of powers work, and Canadians will be familiar with the division of power between our federal government and our provincial government. But in the UK situation, it's really incumbent on support from Westminster, from the Boris Johnson government to have any sort of income support programs approved at that level and not necessarily within Scotland. So what are some of the challenges you are facing as a basic income advocate and as a Scot to try to move this issue forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's fundamentally the biggest challenge. There was a great article, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, in one of the Canadian newspapers that tongue-in-cheek suggested that Scotland should apply to join Canada, because we would actually have far more power as a Canadian province than we do within the UK. And actually, as you read through it, it started to make a bit more sense. Our fundamental issue just now is that, yes, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government have control of about 15% of the social security budget. So effectively, in terms of being able to deliver either a basic income as a policy or basic income experiments even, it's basically impossible unless we have support and buy-in from the UK government as it stands. And that obviously is quite a significant barrier and has been one of the reasons why in many ways the Scottish government have been quite supportive but cautious, because it's seen as not something they can deliver straight away. What's been really, really striking during this crisis is I would say that the discussion on basic income in Scotland has probably moved forward by about a year to a year and a half. So going into this crisis, we were waiting to hear back. The Scottish Government commissioned a group to look at the possibility of running experiments in Scotland. That was due to report back in June. It's now been pushed back because of COVID. But the discussion very much was around, can we test this? Can we look at what was tried in Ontario? Can we learn from that? Can we put something out and see what it looks like in Scotland? That has shifted dramatically. So last week, we had Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, say in a briefing, if I had the powers, I would deliver a basic income now. I mean, in terms of the shift in policy and support, that is huge. And it means that we're now in a position where at the Scottish Parliament, we have a clear majority of parliamentarians who support basic income as a policy, not just as an experimental idea. And I think that is huge because, A, I think it's very likely that we will be heading into another period of constitutional debate. So although we can't deliver basic income as it stands in the UK, and clearly therefore independence for Scotland would be one option to look at it, you could also look at a more federal UK. You could look at a change in the devolution settlement. And so there's a space there for both sides of the constitutional debate to start to engage with it. I think interestingly, England, there's some fantastic work going on in England just now. There's a brilliant network of UBI labs that's been set up. We've seen some really good stuff coming from places like Doncaster and Leeds and Sheffield and Newcastle in the north of England. Some really exciting, Liverpool as well. When the crisis kicked in, there was an early day motion at Parliament, and a letter was sent to the Chancellor every political party at the UK House of Parliament had somebody signing those other than the Conservatives. So we're seeing this very broad cross-party interest. And so even though Scotland can't currently deliver it, creating the space, I think, starts to drive the overall agenda. How do you stand in the way of that if people are starting to look for it? Crucially as well, and there'll be something coming out in the next couple of weeks that'll add into this, the public opinion is starting to shift. And I think that's for several reasons. So, I mean, recent polls have shown support for basic income across the EU as a whole now, but actually with differences between different nations, as you would expect. But I think what we're seeing is, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of people who are having to engage with the current systems who didn't previously. The reality of that is changing people's minds. I think as well, and I'm a natural idealist and optimist, I think what we've seen in this crisis, amongst some of the many feelings, is an outpouring of empathy. People are accepting major restrictions on their own liberty to benefit and protect people they will probably never meet. And I think there's something really positive in that, something we need to harness if we're going to address the climate emergency we're in, but also something that lends itself to basic income, that responds to some of those challenges that Scott highlighted a minute ago. I think as well, people are starting to see, and I know there was a question in the chat and the comments there, had we gone into this crisis with that safety net, with that floor there that people knew they had, it would have been a different response. People would have been able to make different choices, and that could have had a significant impact, I think, on the course of the infection itself. So I think people are seeing that these things that we've been talking about for quite a while, you know, that Scott's highlighted in books, that Andrew Yang's talked about, that's been highlighted in the Ontario experiments, we all know they're there. We know the insecurity, we know the precariousness. This crisis has really brought that home for people, and I think that gives us a real case for optimism that we can move this in something that's not just going back to the way things were.
Great, thank you, Jamie. I'm going to turn my last question to Kim, and then we'll get to a few of the questions that you've been posting in the Q&A box. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to get through as many as we can. But Kim, both Scott and Jamie talked about some of the challenges of building nonpartisan support, particularly amongst conservative thinkers. But you were able, you and Senator Francis Lankin were able to bring on board 50 senators from our red chamber, and some of those included former conservatives. What were some of the arguments and discussions you had about encouraging and seeing if your colleagues in the Senate would sign on to the letter for minimum basic income?
Yeah, thank you. And it's very similar to the discussions that in terms of the pandemic that were happening. But a little bit different is in February, I mentioned that why I joined the Senate. In February, I had launched what's called an inquiry in our upper chamber, which is basically I put out the idea of, you know, we should be looking at a guaranteed livable income. These are the reasons why. These are all the groups that are not being assisted right now. This is how it would impact health issues. This is how it could impact criminal legal issues, and others started to think about it. So senators were already on on notice that I was asking them to think about this and to contribute to the discussion. And the idea, and as well, Francis Lankin had put out, had passed a motion or had introduced a motion indicating we should be looking at better wage and benefit conditions for people who are in the gig economy, looking at, subsidies, as well as looking at, the entire panoply of lack of resources for many workers that you've already canvassed as well. And so the two of us launched those in February. And then we have the pandemic hit. And so many senators were already talking about it. We had also been reaching out. We have a cross-chamber, so the House of Commons and the Senate, we have a cross-chamber anti-poverty caucus. And so virtually everybody in that caucus was already in favor. And that, again, is nonpartisan. So there's folks from every party involved. And so we started to reach out always and decided that when we saw the CERB the Canada Emergency Response Benefit introduced, we immediately saw the gaps, many of us, and said, you know, that's great. It's a wonderful thing. We already have in Canada about 33 basic income initiatives, you can put it that way. We have a child benefit, we have an old age benefit, we have all kinds of tax breaks, and so we were already starting to talk about what could we do 50 years on from a report that was the first in Canada of which I'm aware, called the Kroll Report. And Senator Kroll was obviously in the Senate. And in 1971, the Senate put out a report on how we could end poverty in Canada and talked about the urgent need to end poverty 50 years ago. And one of the recommendations was a basic income. And so really we were building on momentum that had existed as well. Two senators who had done a tremendous amount of work were incredibly instrumental. As you all know, none of this is done by one person alone. It requires the collectivity and a movement. And so Hugh Segal, who you had worked with, Tom, and many others who had been a Conservative senator, Art Eggleton, who was a Liberal senator, both of whom have since retired, were instrumental in that as well. And so what we did was reach out and say, you know, this is an idea, we'd like to support and push that the government, instead of keep patching the CERB, add a new mechanism like we'll be doing again tomorrow in the Senate. Instead, let's look at something that is more universally accessible, so a bit different from what I think of as a universal basic income, not going to everybody, that has some income testing. And in large part because in Canada, as I'm sure in most parts of the world, those who make the most often don't look like they have a very high income because they can afford incredibly, they're wealthy, they hire tax accountants to help hide most of that income. And that was confirmed by Art Eggleton, who used to be an accountant. So those were some of the issues that we were looking at. And so we put it out to the other senators. And since then, it's actually been growing. Yesterday, we had a meeting and talked more about, what are the next steps. And so our current plans are to urge the government to not just this time, the period we're in, but the next phase of this recovery. And then beyond that, looking at a longer term strategy that involves engaging with our Indigenous peoples as well, because of the particular governance issues that are a challenge or require to be included, as well as provincial and territorial authorities. And so we already have some really good templates. We have guidelines that the provinces and territories agreed to in this during this pandemic and these crises. I don't think it's a very, a long step to then say, let's make those some national standards and engage in the dialogue of how we use the resources currently being spent on social assistance, which is a means-tested, a mean-spirited means-tested in most cases approach, and pull that back. And already we have the province where my dad grew up after his family moved from Boston. Prince Edward Island is in a province that's looking at this. BC is another one. And so we're hoping that we'll see not just more pilots, but actually see the implementation and the interest in engaging in this and developing something in at least two of the provinces, and then hopefully moving forward for a much broader national initiative.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim. And although I would have loved to get to a few other questions, looking more deeply at some of the international response to basic income. There was an important report out of Finland just last week, and we know Spain has been looking at the idea of basic income. But more generally, Paul asks a question that I think we should try to tackle if we can. How can UBI be implemented in poorer countries around the world? So I think that's maybe something we could tackle fairly quickly here. Any thoughts, Scott, Jamie, Kim?
Yeah, I would just, I always like to point out that when we say poorer countries, a lot of that is that they're rich in natural resources, but it's not actually going to the people. It's going to a very few amount of people in control. And there's a lot of extraction coming from other countries who are extracting that wealth out of those countries. So part of the response, I think, in order to create basic income in these countries is to really look at Alaska as a model. saying like, okay, we have natural wealth, let's make sure it goes to everyone instead of just a few people. And also, I think it's important to look at all the subsidies that go on in a lot of these countries too. Like India is just full of subsidies as a great example. But there's a lot of assistance going in different directions, and there's a lot of loss of income and assistance through those channels. And it could be a lot more efficient and more effective going to people directly. So I think those are always two different things to look at for other countries.
Right. And Francine, somewhat related to that, has asked, has any country introduced a true basic income program since the start of the pandemic? So I referenced Spain, Jamie. I know you're somewhat connected into the Basic Income Earth Network and what's happening in Europe. Spain's one example of a country that has announced interest in basic income. Have they taken it far enough?
No, so I mean, I think what Spain is a good example of how basic income's become a very popular topic, which is great, and a popular name. And so it gets applied to a lot of things that are not actually basic income. So if we see the core characteristics of basic income being universal, unconditional, and paid individually to everyone, the suggestion in Spain is actually for a targeted payment towards families primarily, that is paid to a household. It has conditions. You get a different level depending on number of children and previous earnings. And so it isn't a basic income, it's a form of targeted support. What I would say is very useful about it is that it's a policy, though, that's not just an emergency response. So this is a policy that's intended to continue permanently beyond COVID. And I think that's important to move away from, yes, we need immediate responses, but we also need to be looking at the longer term process. And I think that's positive itself. In terms of the global movement, I mean, the last I looked at it, I think it was about 170 odd countries had introduced some sort of social security, social protection measure, and a significant proportion of them were direct cash payments. None of them were actual basic incomes at this stage in that sense. Although there had been a note, and I haven't been able to find any more about it, that the Pacific Island of Tuvalu was actually going to introduce an actual basic income for all its citizens. So maybe it will get to take the crown of being first. I think what's been critical in that is that the United Nations, across the board really, more and more seem to be moving towards recognition that actually paying cash to people is where you make the fundamental difference. And I think that will help to shape some of those global discussions that Scott touched on there, and that we've seen. There's a world basic income movement that's looking at that in different ways. We've seen lots of countries trying it, but we're still waiting to see who's going to take the first leap into full delivery.
I just want to point out too that Brazil is interesting because, of course, Brazil is the only country in the world that actually has basic income written into law and passed. They did that in 2004. It was just up to the executive in order to actually implement it. And now we're seeing that there's that push there because that was already on the books. It's easier. And so a lot of all governors but one there came out in support of actually implementing it. And they pushed and pushed, and they did start something that's, again, it's a targeted measure. It's not fully universal, but I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that there already was that on the law already written down that they could actually leverage. So that, too, is something to think about, where if you just get this passed to the point where even if it's targeted, it's easier to actually try to get it out to more people.
Thanks, Scott. One of the age-old criticisms of basic income has always been that question: is it basic income at the expense of other social programs? So Sharon asks a question: how can UBI be implemented without the loss of other social service supports? And Kim, in her earlier comments, had discussed one of the reasons she got into the Senate was to protect those critical social policies that vulnerable and low-income Canadians rely on. So I'll throw that out to the panel as well, because I know each of you in your own jurisdictions have talked about those challenges. Is it basic income at the expense of other things? Anybody want to go first on that one?
Well, I would say absolutely not, that it can't be, or else it's, it then just becomes a sham, because, rents will go up, employers will use it as a way to supplement wages instead of having appropriate wages and benefit packages for folks. And so I think we need a full strategy. We need a homelessness strategy, or I should say a housing strategy, not a homelessness, a housing strategy. We need the income strategy. We need childcare. We need all of those services to be universally accessible. And I stand to be corrected, but in Canada, we have a wide array. Part of the reason some of us are more interested in an income tested, not a means based, but an income tested type of approach, I already mentioned, because of the issues in terms of the very wealthy. But we're also an incredibly, many countries are very diverse, in the United States as well. But someone living in the house they've inherited after 3 generations in Cape Breton versus the person living in downtown Toronto or Vancouver, we already have a tax system that can adjust for those differences. And I think we could develop those kinds of tests that would really, allow us to ensure that people are getting what they need, and not just to be stuck in poverty, but to get a leg up and out of poverty, in addition to all these other approaches. And I think of the difference between what Finland did when they found oil versus what Alberta did, one of the provinces in Canada. They're about the same population. Alberta, everybody got money. They had no tax income or no sales tax. I lived there for a period of time. So people were doing really well in that part of the country. Instead of having those resources shared, invested in better universally accessible programs for everybody, it went to Albertans first and foremost, and then even though there were resources that were the country's resources, if I could put it that way, whereas my understanding is Finland instead put those resources into a dividend that allowed basically every community has a viable health system. Every community has drinkable water. We can't say that in Canada. And so, I think the investment in different ways and picking up on the points that Scott and Jamie made, I think, if we actually invest in people rather than investing in capitalism first and foremost, I think we have a very different result in the end.
Great, thank you, Kim. Any thoughts, Jamie or Scott?
Yeah, I just like to always stress that basic income is a foundational floor. And so once you have a floor that does not exist right now, then some programs actually no longer make any sense to exist on top of that floor. And some programs make sense to exist on top of that floor to a lesser degree. And some programs should exist entirely as they are right now on top of that floor. And I think that it's up to every country to debate those programs and actually be honest about them too. I think that we see a lot of, say, progressives fighting to maintain programs that are actually hurting people. TANF here in the US is one of those examples. It's actually a program that is effectively increasing racial inequality because of the way that it works the block grant to the states. And so I think that is a program that needs to be eliminated entirely, with that money going to the basic income instead. But I do think that for the most part, we need to look at these and be honest and figure out, which makes sense and which doesn't.
Yeah, and just to add in very quickly there that, I agree with everything that's been said. I think one of the things we've had to reinforce quite consistently here in Scotland is the fact that something like disability support would always be seen as additional, because this is about a universal support. Obviously, disability is very much an individual experience of life. And I think there were questions asking about, Indigenous populations. I think you could still see some groups where additional support, as Scott says is necessary. But I think particularly disability, I've often found talking to disability support groups that until we've been clear about that, it seemed a really quite concerning and scary prospect. Whereas once you combine the two, it becomes quite an emancipatory one.
Okay. Thanks, Jamie. So another potential critique here, just playing devil's advocate, what do you say to those that feel people would leave their jobs, or not, perhaps in our case, currently not go back to their jobs if a basic income were implemented?
Yeah, I like to say that UBI is not about paying people to do nothing. It's about paying people to do anything. And it really shows that there's a structural incentive that's different there, where, this concern that people are not going to work, it actually shows that people have no choice but to work. And when you do that, I mean, that's actually what causes a lot of these problems as far as people having no bargaining power, so they accept any wage possible, any low wage possible. And it's also something I'm really worried about right now. I think we're in a position where we actually all lost a lot of power. People, even if you have your job right now, you're actually, let's say, more concerned about losing it. So then maybe you're more accepting of things that you wouldn't accept. Maybe you're now feel like you have to be a yes man, according, to keep your job. And what does that look like? An economy full of yes men who are just agreeing to everything, in a position where we actually need a lot of honesty and a lot of like real discussion to figure out how we're going to go forward. And I think that's also directly related to this massive amount of mental health distress going on right now. In the US, I was really disturbed to see that for those 18 to 44, about 38% of them are experiencing severe mental distress. And that's 10 times what it was before this all started. And of course, if you look at those who are experiencing the least, it's those who are seniors and experiencing 9% severe mental distress. And so it really shows that we have a Social Security floor for a certain group and no one else. And it shows that it really makes a huge difference right now. So yeah, I think that it's important that we give people the power to say no, because it also means that they have the greater power to say yes to things as well. And all these problems happen because people, don't have that power.
Well said. We only have about 2 minutes left, unfortunately. I'm going to ask Senator Pate the last question, and it's specifically a Canadian focus. But what ways can we put real pressure on the federal government to implement a basic income in Canada? If this pandemic has taught us anything, it is this: we all need a basic income so the vulnerable never fall through the cracks. And that was from Benita. Any final thoughts on that, Kim?
Well, I do think letting us know what is happening is vitally important. And, when I've heard, just the last couple of days, I've heard some of my colleagues and some members of parliament talking about just, what we were just talking about, what about the people who are going to be layabouts? Well, we know all of the research shows that's actually not true. That, some people choose to take care of family, some people choose to be investing in education in terms of taking time to educate, or to do other things that are contribute to the community in other ways. And I think we need to be underscoring that is the kind of fear-mongering and discriminatory attitudes and classist attitudes that have created the stigma around poor people, around those on social assistance for far too long, and that we need to challenge it. So I'd say, let us know. I'm already on side, but I'm happy to hear from you as well, and also, but to be letting the Prime Minister know, letting all of the cabinet ministers, as well as there are apparently almost as many, if not more, members of parliament as senators who would have signed on to the letter that we sent. And so, I think there's already a lot of support. We need the public to be letting the elected officials know that in fact this is something they support. Because prior to this, what people used to always say to me is, no government will bring this in because you won't see the cost benefit in one electoral cycle. It'll likely take 1, 2, maybe 3 or more electoral cycles. I think now is the time. We know this is a pandemic. We're being told by epidemiologists it's not the only one, and we're likely to see more. And so now is the time we need to shore up our economic, our health, and our social safety nets. And so I'd say, challenge us to do that.
Great. Terrific way to end, Senator Pate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Scott. A fascinating discussion. I'm really sorry we didn't get time to get to all of the questions, but we'll do our best to answer them offline, and we'll hope to do this again very soon. So I'll turn it back to Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Stay safe. Thanks, Tom, and thank you, everybody on the panel. Thank you to those who joined us today for your contributions and for joining us. It was a great discussion. Over the next few months, we, Tamarack, are going to be offering free weekly webinars and live podcasts. So you can equip yourself with community change by joining us for these free training and capacity building webinars and live podcasts. Thank you once again for learning with us today. Send any of your questions, comments, and feedback about this webinar to me at natasha@tamarackcommunity.ca. We are always trying to improve the experience.